The crystal champagne flute trembled ever so slightly in my hand, creating tiny ripples across the golden liquid. 15 years of marriage had taught me to read the subtle signs others missed. Tonight, those signs were everywhere. "To 15 wonderful years," my husband Robert announced, his voice carrying across the private dining room of Sapphire, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. His hand kept straying to adjust his Hermes tie, a nervous tell I'd noted years ago. And to many more successes to come. I watched him over the rim of my glass as our gathered friends and colleagues raised their flutes in response. Something was off. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Robert was too polished tonight, too calculated in his movements. Even the way he'd insisted on this lavish celebration seemed forced, especially given his usual disregard for our anniversary. I took a small sip of champagne, letting the bubbles dance on my tongue as I studied the faces around the table. That's when I noticed her. Sophia Reed, our new marketing director, seated 3 places down. She was watching Robert with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Her perfectly manicured fingers toyed with something in her lap, hidden beneath her crisp linen napkin. I'd seen that nervous gesture before in board meetings when executives were about to make career-defining presentations. The irony wasn't lost on me. In many ways, this dinner was indeed career-defining, just not in the way most people at this table imagined. "Catherine has been by my side through everything," Robert continued, his practiced smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Through the early struggles of building Reed International from the ground up, through every success and setback." I felt my lips curve into a smile that matched his insincerity. If only he knew the company he so proudly claimed to have built had been mine since before we'd met. My father's legacy, entrusted to me when he passed, with the strict instruction to keep the ownership private until I was ready to take the reins publicly. Robert had never questioned why a small consulting firm had hired him as CEO with such generous terms. His ego wouldn't allow him to look too closely at his good fortune. And now, after 15 years of watching him take credit for my father's and my hard work, it seemed the facade was about to crack, though not in the way he anticipated. I glanced down at my father's vintage Cartier watch on my wrist. Thomas Reed had worn it the day he signed his first billion-dollar deal. "Remember, Catherine," he told me, "timing isn't just important in business, it's everything." I'd worn it every day since his passing 5 years ago, a constant reminder of his wisdom and patience. Robert paused, his eyes flickering to Sophia for just a moment too long. "As we celebrate 15 years together, I want to thank everyone for being here to share this special evening." The pause that followed felt endless. Sophia shifted in her seat, her hand tightening around whatever she held beneath the table. I watched as she gave Robert a slight nod, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. My heart rate didn't quicken. My breath didn't catch. Instead, a strange calm settled over me as I realized what was about to happen. Part of me had been waiting for this moment for months, ever since Sarah, my informant in the marketing department, had first reported their private meetings. Actually, Sophia's voice cut through the quiet, clear and confident as she stood. "Robert has something else he'd like to share." She withdrew her hand from beneath the napkin. A diamond ring caught the light, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the white tablecloth. The room collectively held its breath. I could feel the weight of all eyes darting between Sophia, Robert, and Mether Horror. Their morbid fascination, their anticipation of the drama about to unfold. Time seemed to slow. In that suspended moment, I saw not just the present scene but 15 years of memories overlaid like transparent photographs. Robert accepting the CEO position with boyish excitement. Our wedding day, with my father giving me away, his knowing eyes meeting mine as he placed my hand in Robert's Late nights in our home office, as I helped Robert with strategies he believed were his own. All of it leading to this moment of betrayal that, ironically, would finally set me free. Robert stood straighter, squaring his shoulders like he did before hostile takeover announcements. "Catherine and I have grown apart," he began, his voice taking on that same tone he used when firing long-term employees. "We've been living separate lives for years, and it's time to be honest with everyone. Sophia and I are in love. We're getting married as soon as the divorce is finalized." The silence that followed was deafening. Faces turned to me, expecting tears, expecting a scene. I could see Robert tense, preparing for the hysterics he thought would follow. But 15 years of watching him in boardrooms had taught me the power of stillness, of silence. I lifted my champagne glass, took another measured sip, and smiled, not the practiced social smile I'd worn all evening, but a genuine one that seemed to unsettle Robert more than any outburst could have. Because in that moment, as he stood there thinking he'd orchestrated my greatest humiliation, I knew exactly how this would end. "Congratulations," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. "I think this calls for another toast." I raised my glass higher, watching confusion cloud Robert's features. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. Beside him, Sophia's triumphant smile faltered slightly. "To new beginnings," I continued, "and to Monday's shareholder meeting. I imagine it will be quite illuminating for everyone involved." Jonathan Pierce, head of our board and Robert's longtime golf partner, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue for—" "Oh, I disagree, Jonathan," I replied, setting down my glass with deliberate care. "I think transparency is exactly what's needed right now, don't you?" My father had always told me that timing was everything in business and in life. Wait for the moment, when they're most confident, most certain of their victory, he'd said. That's when they're most vulnerable. As I met Robert's increasingly uncertain gaze, I knew that moment had arrived. The drive home from Sapphire was silent, the city lights blurring past my window like scattered stars. Robert had left with Sophia, of course his final power play of the evening. I sat in the back of my private car, watching raindrops race down the tinted windows, each one carrying a memory of the past 15 years. James, my driver and one of the few people who knew my true role at Reed International, kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. He'd been my father's driver before mine, had watched me grow from a determined young heiress into the silent owner of a global empire. "Would you like me to take the scenic route, miss?" "Reed?" he asked, his voice gentle with understanding. I smiled at his use of my real surname rather than Morgan. James was one of the few people who still called me Reed. "No," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my tone. "Take me to the office instead." The city's financial district rose before us, a forest of glass and steel reaching toward the night sky. Reed International occupied the top 15 floors of the most prestigious building my father's vision made manifest. As we pulled into the private underground garage, I caught my reflection in the window. I expected to see devastation, tears, something that matched the scandal I'd just endured. Instead, I saw clarity, purpose, and an unmistakable sense of liberation. The private elevator hummed as it carried me to the top floor. At this hour, the office was empty save for the security team, who nodded respectfully as I passed. They too were part of my father's old guard, loyal to the Reed name rather than to the man who currently sat in the CEO's chair. I entered my private office officially listed as a document storage room and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of lights and shadows. Somewhere out there, Robert was probably celebrating with Sophia, thinking he'd orchestrated the perfect coup. The thought didn't hurt as much as it should have. Perhaps because I'd seen it coming for months. Or perhaps because, after 15 years of playing the supportive wife, I was ready to step into the light. My phone buzzed incessant concerned friends, board members who'd been at the dinner, gossip-hungry socialites. I ignored them all, walking instead to the hidden safe behind my father's old painting. Inside lay the document I'd never thought I'd need to use, the original ownership papers of Reed International, along with my father's letter. My dearest Catherine, I read aloud, his words as clear now as they were the day he wrote them. If you're reading this, you've decided it's time to step out of the shadows. Remember what I taught you. Power isn't in what you show, it's in what you keep hidden. When the moment comes to reveal yourself, make it count, make it devastating, make it a lesson they'll never forget. I was 23 when my father called me into his office, his face grave with the news that would change everything. The cancer diagnosis gave him 2 years at most, not enough time to groom me publicly as his successor. The business world isn't ready for a woman your age to take over openly, he'd said, hands folded on his desk. Let them underestimate you. Let them think you're just another trust fund daughter. Watch, learn, and when you're ready, show them who you really are. I'd argued with him at first. I don't want to hide who I am, I'd insisted. I've earned my MBA. I've worked in every department. I'm ready. My father's smile had been sad, but knowing. You're ready to run the business, Catherine, but they're not ready for you. Not yet. He'd shown me the restructuring documents that would make me the sole owner, while installing a CEO as the public face. Choose someone hungry, he'd advised. Someone whose ambition will blind them to questioning their good fortune. That someone had been Robert Morgan, a rising star at a competing firm. Handsome, ambitious, and woefully unaware of how perfectly he fit into our plan. I settled into my leather chair, spreading the company documents across my desk. Robert had always been so proud of his rise to CEO, boasting about how he'd been chosen to lead Reed International at such a young age. He'd never questioned why a board of directors would entrust a billion-dollar company to someone barely out of his 30s. His ego had blinded him to the truth, that every step of his ascent had been carefully orchestrated. He'd forgotten the first rule of corporate takeovers: know your opponent's true position. Monday was approaching, and with it, the moment Robert would learn exactly who he'd been sleeping beside for 15 years. Opening my laptop, I began reviewing the documents for Monday's shareholder meeting. Robert had spent months preparing for his big restructuring announcement, this plan to streamline operations by eliminating the old guard my father had put in place. He had no idea that I'd been quietly purchasing more shares through shell companies, consolidating my already controlling interest. By Monday morning, I would own nearly 80% of Reed International's voting shares. A notification popped up on my screen, an email from Sophia to the board, announcing her resignation as marketing director, effective immediately. How considerate of her to save me the trouble. I forwarded it to HR, adding a note to process her exit package without the customary executive bonuses. I spent the next hour reviewing Robert's recent decisions, seeing them now through the lens of his deception. How many of his business dinners had been with Sophia? How many company resources had he diverted to impress her? The audit would be thorough, and every misused dollar would be accounted for. Standing, I walked back to the windows. Dawn was breaking over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In a few hours, Robert would swagger into this building, probably rehearsing how to spin last night's events to the board. He had no idea that his keycard would be deactivated, his passwords changed, his access to the executive floor revoked. My phone buzzed again, a message from Robert himself. We should talk about how to handle this professionally. I smiled, remembering all the times I'd watched him handle corporate takeovers. He always offered to talk professionally right before he gutted a company. But he'd never faced an opponent who knew his playbook by heart, who had spent 15 years studying his every move. "Yes," I typed back. "Let's discuss it at Monday's shareholder meeting." In the soft morning light filtering through the windows, I stood still, feeling the weight of the decision I'd made. This wasn't just about Robert's betrayal or Sophia's ambition. It was about claiming what was mine, about honoring my father's legacy, about finally becoming the woman I was always meant to be. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel everything I'd suppressed during that painful dinner. The humiliation, the anger, the grief for a marriage that had perhaps never been real. The emotions washed through me, powerful but cleansing, like a summer storm, and when they passed, I was left with a profound sense of purpose and an unexpected feeling of freedom. The weekend stretched before me like a blank canvas, every hour an opportunity to prepare for Monday's revelation. I spent Saturday morning in my home office, the space Robert had always dismissed as my hobby room, where I supposedly planned charity events. If he'd ever bothered to look closer, he might have noticed the hidden terminal accessing Reed International's secure servers, or the files detailing every major company decision of the past 15 years. My first call was to Lawrence Chin, our long-standing corporate counsel. The irony of his sharing Sophia's surname wasn't lost on me. They were distant cousins, a fact Robert had either overlooked or ignored in his arrogance. "I saw the guest list for Monday's shareholder meeting," Lawrence said, his tone carefully neutral. "I assume you're finally ready?" "Yes," I replied, pulling up the documentation we'd prepared years ago. "Execute Protocol Artemis." There was a pause on the line, followed by the sound of rapid typing. Protocol Artemis, named after the goddess of the hunt, was a contingency plan my father had created. It involved a complex series of legal maneuvers designed to lock down the company's assets and freeze any unauthorized transfers. Robert had no idea it existed, just as he had no idea that Lawrence's true loyalty lay with the Reed family. "It's done," Lawrence confirmed. "All major financial decisions now require dual authorization from both the CEO and the owner. Given that you're the owner, Robert won't be able to move anything significant before Monday." "Perfect," I smiled, imagining Robert's frustration when he discovered his executive override codes suddenly required secondary approval. "What about the other matter?" "The private investigator's reports are quite thorough," Lawrence replied. 6 months of documentation meetings, expenses, hotel receipts. They've been using the Milan acquisition as cover for their relationship. Every trip, every dinner, charged to the company account. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. The Milan deal Robert's pride and joy. The acquisition he claimed would cement his legacy. How fitting that it would instead become evidence of his misconduct. "Send copies to HR and the board's ethics committee," I instructed. "But hold them until Monday morning, 1 hour before the meeting." After hanging up, I moved to my next task. Opening my laptop, I accessed the company's internal messaging system. As expected, the executive floor was buzzing with weekend activity crisis management in full swing. Victoria had already cleared out her office, but Robert was there, probably trying to damage control. I watched his digital footprints as he accessed file after file, attempting to move money between accounts, make last-minute changes to Monday's presentation. Each attempt met with the new security protocols requiring an approval he couldn't obtain. His frustration was evident in the increasingly aggressive way he typed, the multiple failed override attempts. A message popped up from Diana Wilson, my father's former secretary and now the board's administrative director. "He's calling an emergency board meeting for Sunday afternoon. Claims it's about recent developments affecting company stability." "Perfect," I replied. Decline due to insufficient notice. Chite bailo, 47. Diana's response came with a hint of satisfaction. Already done. He's not taking it well. I spent the next few hours methodically reviewing the Milan acquisition documents. Every detail Robert and Sophia had tried to hide was there, buried in expense reports and meeting minutes. They'd been sloppy, confident in their security clearance and Robert's position as CEO. They hadn't considered that someone higher up might be watching. Around midnight, my phone lit up with Robert's name. I let it ring, imagining him pacing in his office, tie loosened, hair disheveled from running his hands through this typical stress response. When it went to voicemail, he sent a text. The board meeting denial is ridiculous. This situation needs to be addressed before markets open Monday. You're being childish. I screenshot the message, adding it to my growing file. Classic Robert, attempting to gaslight, to make me appear emotional and unprofessional. It had worked in our marriage, but it would fail spectacularly in the boardroom. Another text followed. Sophia and I are willing to be generous in the divorce settlement. Don't force this into a corporate issue. Generous. The word hung in the air, laden with condescension. He still thought he held all the cards, still believed he was the one with something to offer. His assumption that I would need or want his generosity would be his undoing. I opened our home security app, watching through the cameras as Robert finally returned to collect some clothes. He moved through the house with entitled confidence, selecting his most expensive suits, his prized watches. I made note of everything he took evidence for the asset freeze Lawrence would implement first thing Monday morning. As he passed through the library, he paused at the photograph of my father and me at my college graduation. It was the only picture in the house that showed us at the Reed International offices, standing before the company logo. Robert had always assumed it was taken during a casual visit, never questioning why my father's arm was draped proudly around my shoulder as we stood in the CEO's office, which would later become Robert's, and soon would acknowledge its true owner. I watched him shake his head at the photo before leaving, no doubt dismissing it as another painful reminder of the family life he was discarding in his rush to start his new life with Sophia. He'd forgotten the first rule of corporate takeovers: know your opponent's true position. Later that night, I found myself drawn to my father's study room in our home that Robert rarely entered. I ran my fingers along the spines of leather-bound books, breathing in the lingering scent of my father's favorite cigars. In this room, he had taught me everything about business, about power, about patience. I pulled out his favorite book, Sun Tzu's The Art of Warand, opened it to the passage he had underlined. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. A tear slipped down my cheek, the first I had allowed myself since Robert's announcement. Not for the marriage I was losing, but for the father who had prepared me so well for this moment, who wouldn't be here to see his lessons come to fruition. I held the book to my chest, feeling a connection to him that transcended death. In the quiet stillness of the night, I could almost hear his voice. You're ready now, Catherine. Show them who you really are. Monday was approaching, and with it, the moment Robert would learn exactly who he'd been sleeping beside for 15 years. Sunday unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. I arrived at the office before dawn, the same outfit I'd worn to the anniversary dinner now replaced with a tailored Chanel suit in deep navy, me father's favorite color for power moves. The security team nodded with newfound respect. Word had clearly spread through the old guard that the true Reed was finally emerging from the shadows. The executive floor was eerily quiet, but the digital landscape told a different story. My private terminal lit up with alerts Robert had spent the night attempting to access restricted servers, trying to move assets, making desperate calls to board members. Each attempt left a digital fingerprint, each call recorded in the system's logs. His panic was becoming palpable. Sarah Lynn, Sophia's former assistant and my longtime informant, had sent her final report. The details were illuminating. Sophia has been planning this move for months, Sarah noted, carefully orchestrating her announcement to coincide with the Milan deal's completion. She believed it would force your quick, quiet departure, leaving her perfectly positioned to step into both your roles as wife and as the company's marketing voice. She's been practicing her new signature, Sarah added. Mrs. Sophia Morgan Reed. She's already ordered personalized stationery. I allowed myself a small smile at that detail. Sophia's ambition had made her careless, had led her to celebrate her victory before ensuring her position. It was the same mistake Robert often made in business, assuming success before the contracts were signed. A gentle knock at my door announced Diana Wilson's arrival. She carried a stack of folders and a knowing smile. "The board members have been calling all morning," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Jonathan Pierce is particularly interested in knowing why his longtime golf partner suddenly can't access the executive accounts." Jonathan Pierce, Robert's strongest ally on the board, and, not coincidentally, the man who'd introduced him to Sophia at last year's charity gala. The pieces were falling into place. "Let them wonder," I replied, accepting the folders. "Have all the necessary documents been delivered to their offices?" Diana's smile widened. "Every board member received a comprehensive packet this morning by special courier. Your father would be proud you even used his preferred delivery service." Always control the narrative. "Catherine, my father had told me during one of our weekend strategy sessions. I was 25 then, still chafing at the constraints of my hidden role. But why can't I just tell people who I am?" I'd asked. "Why all this secrecy?" He'd looked at me with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see decades into the future. "Because the moment you declare yourself, the game changes. Everyone adjusts their strategy to account for your true position." He'd tapped his chessboard, where we'd been playing a mat. "Right now, they're playing against a pawn, not realizing it's actually a queen. That gives you tremendous advantage." "For how long?" I'd asked. "How long do I have to pretend?" "Until the right moment," he'd said. "You'll know it when it comes. And when it does, you don't just reveal yourself, you deliver all the evidence, all at once, to everyone who matters. You control the narrative completely." The packets contained irrefutable evidence of Robert and Sophia's misuse of company resources, along with detailed documentation of my ownership. By now, the board members would be discovering that their CEO's authority had always been contingent on my silent approval. My phone buzzed with a text from Lawrence. "Robert is in the lobby with his personal lawyer. They're demanding access to the executive floor." "Maintain protocol," I replied. "No access without proper authorization." I turned to the security feeds, watching as Robert argued with the lobby security team. His usual polished appearance was notably disheveled, his tie slightly askew, his hair showing signs of a restless night. Beside him, a man in an ill-fitting suit gesticulated wildly, waving what appeared to be hastily printed documents. "His lawyer, from Caldwell and Brooks," Diana noted, peering at the screen. "Third-tier firm, specializes in quick divorces. Clearly, he hasn't figured out what's really happening yet." The thought was oddly satisfying. Robert had been so focused on orchestrating my personal humiliation that he'd failed to see the larger picture forming around him. He still believed this was about our marriage, about division of assets and prenuptial agreements. He had no idea he was about to face a very different kind of legal battle. I spent the next few hours reviewing the final details for the meeting. The presentation Robert had prepared, his grand vision for restructuring the company, was still loaded on the system. I scrolled through it with mild amusement, noting how he'd planned to dismiss key employees, all while positioning himself as the company's savior. Around midday, Sophia made her own attempt to enter the building. The security footage showed her trying to use her executive access card, then becoming increasingly agitated when it was declined. She'd dressed for a power-movered blazer, stiletto heels, perfect makeup, but her composure cracked as she was politely but firmly escorted out. "She's called HR 3 times, Sarah reported via secure message, demanding to know why her credentials have been revoked. Should I have them return her calls? "No need," I replied. "Everything will be clarified in tomorrow's meeting." As the day progressed, more pieces of my strategy fell into place. The private investigators delivered their final report, including photographs of Robert and Sophia at various company-funded rendezvous. The audit team completed their review of the Milan acquisition, highlighting every questionable expense and unauthorized decision. The legal team finished preparing the documents that would restore my family name to its rightful place in the company hierarchy. By sunset, the stage was set. I stood at my office window, watching the city lights flicker to life. Somewhere out there, Robert was probably meeting with his lawyer, planning his defense against what he thought would be a simple divorce proceeding. Sophia was likely planning her triumphant return to the office, unaware that her career in corporate marketing was about to become collateral damage in a much larger fall from grace. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed world they'd built on my silence would crumble. Tomorrow, the whispered name of Reed would echo through the corridors with its true weight. Tomorrow, they would learn the cost of underestimating the quiet wife who had watched and waited for 15 years. As I prepared to leave for the night, I paused before the portrait of my father that hung in my private office. In the painting, his eyes held that same knowing look he'd given me on my wedding day, the look that said he understood the role Robert would play in our long game. I touched the frame gently, whispering, "It's time, Dad. Tomorrow, everyone will know who really controls Reed International." I gathered my things, a strange calm settling over me. For 15 years, I'd lived in the shadows, watching, learning, biding my time. Tonight would be the last night of that life. Tomorrow, Catherine Reed would step into the light. I left the office after midnight, exhausted but focused. James was waiting with the car, his familiar presence comforting after such an intense day. "Home, Miss Morgan?" he asked, as I settled into the back seat. I looked at him in the rearview mirror, seeing the loyalty and understanding in his eyes. James had been with my family for over 30 years. He'd driven my father to his most important meetings, had waited outside my college graduation, had been the one to drive me to the hospital when my father took his final breath. "No, James," I replied, making a decision. "Take me to the penthouse." A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "The Reed penthouse, Miss Morgan. It hasn't been opened since your father's passing." "Yes," I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. "And James?" "I think it's time we stopped using that name. From now on, it's Miss Reed." His smile widened as he pulled away from the curb. "Welcome back, Miss Reed. Your father would be proud." As we drove through the quiet streets of nighttime Manhattan, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Not just the 15 years of my marriage, but the years before that, learning at my father's side, preparing for a role few would understand. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I opened it, curious. "Catherine, it's Margaret Winston. Charles told me what's happening. The wives are with you. Call me when it's done. We have much to discuss." I smiled, thinking of Margaret Winston, wife of Charles Winston, Robert's biggest competitor and my father's old friend. Margaret, who had taken me under her wing after my father died, who had introduced me to the quiet network of CEO wives who knew far more than their husbands suspected. Tomorrow wasn't just about reclaiming my company. It was about joining a legacy of women who had learned to wield power from the shadows, who understood that true influence didn't always announce itself with a nameplate on a door. James pulled up to a sleek high-rise in the heart of the financial districta building my father had purchased decades ago, one that didn't appear in any of the Reed International public holdings. The doorman recognized me immediately. "Miss Reed," he said with a respectful nod. "We've been expecting you. Your father's penthouse is ready." As I rode the private elevator to the top floor, I felt a sense of coming home. This space, untouched since my father's death, represented the truth I'd kept hidden for so long. I stepped into the darkened apartment, memories flooding back as I moved through the rooms. In my father's study, everything remained exactly as he'd left it. The chess set where he'd taught me strategy, the wall of books that had shaped my education, the desk where he'd written the letter I'd opened just days ago. I crossed to the hidden safe behind his bookshelf, entering the combination I'd memorized as a child. Inside lay one final piece of my inheritance that I hadn't touched until now, a small velvet box containing the Reed family signet ring, resized years ago to fit my finger. I slipped it on, feeling the weight of generations of Reed business acumen settling around me. Tomorrow, everyone would know who truly owned Reed International. Tomorrow, Robert Morgan would learn that the woman he'd betrayed was not just his wife, but his boss. And as I looked out over the glittering Manhattan skyline, the empire that was truly mine, I made a silent promise to my father. I would not just reclaim what was mine. I would build it into something greater than even he had imagined. The quiet wife was stepping into the light, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my father's penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I stood before the antique mirror in what had once been his bedroom, adjusting the collar of my Alexander McQueen suit. The deep navy fabric was impeccably a power color my father had always favored for pivotal meetings. "Never wear black to claim victory, Catherine," he'd advised years ago. "Black is for funerals. Navy shows authority without suggesting you're there to bury someone even when you are." I smiled at the memory, running my fingers over the Reed family signet ring now prominently displayed on my right hand. For 15 years, I'd worn only the platinum wedding band Robert had placed on my finger, along with the ostentatious diamond engagement ring. He'd selected a ring chosen more for its visibility in boardrooms than for any romantic sentiment. Today, those rings remained on my dressing table at the penthouse. In their place, the Reed crest caught the morning light, a silent declaration of my true identity. My phone chimed with a message from Lawrence Chen. "Board members arriving early. Pierce is attempting to rally support for an emergency executive session before the shareholder meeting." Of course he was. Jonathan Pierce Roberts' strongest ally, and the man who had introduced him to Sophia would be scrambling to contain the damage. Too late. "Proceed as planned," I replied. "No changes to the schedule." I studied my reflection one final time. The woman looking back at me wasn't Catherine Morgan, the supportive, quiet CEO's wife who nodded politely at charity galas. This was Catherine Reed, sole owner of Reed Holdings and Reed International, stepping fully into her power after 15 years of waiting. The transformation wasn't just in the tailored suit or the confident posture. It was in my eyes, clear, focused, unburdened by the need to play small. For the first time in 15 years, I would walk into the Reed International building as myself. Diana Wilson's voice came through on the intercom system. "The car is ready, Miss Reed. James is waiting downstairs." "Thank you, Diana," I replied, gathering my leather portfolio. "And the special delivery?" "Completed at 7:30 a.m. All board members have received the supplementary documentation. The expressions on their assistants' faces were quite something to behold. I smiled, imagining the chaos unfolding across Manhattan as 12 board members simultaneously discovered the truth about Reed International's ownership structure. The carefully crafted narrative Robert had built over 15 years, the brilliant CEO who'd turned a modest consulting firm into a global powerhouse, was unraveling thread by thread. The elevator descended smoothly to the private garage where James waited beside the Bentley Knot, the one Robert used for client meetings, but my father's personal car, maintained in perfect condition, but rarely seen in public. "Good morning, miss." "Reed," James said, opening the door with a formal bow that couldn't quite hide his smile. "Are we making an entrance today?" "We certainly are, James," I replied, settling into the back seat. "Main entrance, please. It's time everyone knew who was arriving." As we pulled into morning traffic, I reviewed the day's strategy on my tablet. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., giving me just over an hour to prepare once I reached the office. Lawrence had confirmed that Robert had been trying since 5 a.m. to enter the executive floor, but had been consistently denied Accessi's security credentials, having been quietly revoked overnight. My phone rang, Margaret Winston's number appearing on the screen. "Catherine," she said when I answered, her voice warm but businesslike. "The wives are gathering at the Century Club for lunch after your meeting. We expect a full report," though with a seemingly innocent term for one of the most powerful unofficial networks in New York business. The spouses of CEOs, board members, and major investors who had formed their own shadow board of directors years ago. "I'll be there," I promised. "How's Charles handling the anticipation?" Margaret's laugh was rich with amusement. "Oh, he's been insufferable, pacing around since dawn, checking his phone every 3 minutes. He's waited 15 years to see Robert Morgan taken down a peg. The fact that you're the one doing it has him practically giddy." Charles Winston had been one of my father's closest friends and business allies. When my father announced his illness and his plan to install a figurehead CEO while I controlled the company from the shadows, Charles had been skeptical. "She's brilliant, Thomas, no question," he'd said during one of their private dinners that I was now included in. "But this plan of yours, asking her to hide her light for years, possibly decades, it's asking too much." My father had looked at me across the table, his eyes filled with the mixture of pride and concern that characterized our relationship in his final years. "Catherine understands the long game," he'd replied. "Don't you, my dear?" I'd nodded, though privately I'd shared some of Charles's concerns. How long would I need to pretend? How long would I watch someone else, especially someone like Robert Morgan, take credit for my work? "When will you know it's time?" Charles had asked me directly. "When they've shown me exactly who they are," I'd answered. "When they're so confident in their position that they never see me coming." Charles had studied me for a long moment before raising his glass to the hidden queen of Reed International. "May your reign be worth the wait." "Tell Charles I'll see him soon," I told Margaret. "Perhaps at the Winston Global merger announcement next week." "He'll be delighted," Margaret replied. "We both will." As I ended the call, James caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "Miss Reed, we're approaching the building. There appears to be quite a crowd." I leaned forward, surprised to see a gathering of reporters clustered around the main entrance of Reed International Tower. News vans lined the street, cameras at the ready. "It seems someone tipped off the press," I remarked, though I had my suspicions. Diana had connections at every major financial publication in the city, connections she'd maintained on my behalf for years. "Shall I use the private entrance?" James asked. I considered the question, weighing the options. The private entrance would avoid the press, but it would also miss an opportunity. "No," I decided. "Main entrance as planned. It's time for Catherine Reed to make her public debut. The car pulled up to the curb, and immediately the reporters surged forward, cameras flashing. They were expecting Robert, no doubt, hoping to catch him in the aftermath of the public announcement of his affair. What they got instead was an unfamiliar car and an unfamiliar woman. At least, unfamiliar in this context. James opened my door, and I emerged with deliberate poise, straightening to my full height. I wore no expression as I moved toward the entrance, the crowd parting instinctively before me. "Miss Morgan! Miss Morgan!" One reporter broke from the pack, rushing forward with microphone extended. "Can you comment on your husband's relationship with Sophia Reed? How long have you known?" I paused, turning to face her directly. The entire press corps fell silent, cameras trained on my face. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice clear and carrying. "My name is Catherine Reed. I'm the owner of Reed International and Reed Holdings, and I have a shareholders meeting to attend." The stunned silence lasted only a moment before the crowd erupted with questions, cameras flashing frantically. I continued forward, not breaking stride as security rushed to clear a path. Behind me, I could hear the chaos of reporters calling their editors, the story already morphing from a tawdry affair into something far more newsworthy. The revelation of Reed International's true owner. The lobby fell silent as I crossed it, employees stopping mid-conversation to stare. Many had seen me before. Of course, the CEO's elegant wife who occasionally appeared for company functions, but they'd never seen me like this, moving with authority through the space as if I owned it, which of course I did. I bypassed the regular elevators, heading instead for the private executive lift that required special access. The security guard stationed there one of my father's old team straightened as I approached. "Good morning, Miss Reed," he said, loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear as he used my real name. "Welcome back." Inside the elevator, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. Phase 1 of today's carefully orchestrated plan was complete the public introduction of Catherine Reed. By the time I reached the executive floor, the news would be racing through the building and quite possibly across the financial district. The executive reception area was a scene of controlled chaos when the elevator doors opened. Diana Wilson stood at her command post, fielding calls and directing a team of assistants who moved with military precision. She looked up as I approached, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal a smile of profound satisfaction. "Miss Reed," she said formally, "the board members have been arriving. They're currently in the small conference room. Mr. Morgan and his attorney are waiting in the main boardroom with Miss Reed." "Excellent," I replied, handing her my coat. "And the shareholders?" "All connected virtually, as requested. The secure video conference is ready. Lawrence has prepared the final documentation for distribution once you give the word." I nodded, taking a moment to survey what had always been mine, but had never before acknowledged me as its owner. The executive floor of Reed International 50 stories above Manhattan, with its sweeping views and understated luxury, had been designed by my father decades ago. Robert had made minor changes over the years, always positioning them as visionary updates, rather than the cosmetic adjustments they truly were. "It's time," I said simply. Diana nodded, pressing the intercom. "Please inform the board members that Miss Reed will see them now." As I walked toward the small conference room, I felt a strange duality, like I was both Catherine Morgan, taking the final steps in a 15-year journey, and my father's daughter, fulfilling the legacy he had entrusted to me. Every lesson he had taught me, every strategy he had outlined, every patient explanation of how power truly worked, all of it had prepared me for this moment. I wasn't just reclaiming a company, I was reclaiming myself. The board members fell silent as I entered the room, 12 pairs of eyes widening in varying degrees of shock, comprehension, and in a few cases, dawning respect. Jonathan Pierce recovered first, rising from his seat with forced joviality. "Catherine, what an unexpected. This is hardly the appropriate time for the owner of Reed International to attend a shareholder meeting. I finished for him, moving to the head of the table his seat. I disagree, Jonathan. This is precisely the appropriate time." I set my portfolio on the table, standing rather than sitting, a power position my father had taught me years ago. "Gentlemen, I understand you've received some surprising documentation this morning. I'm here to confirm its authenticity and to answer any questions before we proceed to the main shareholder meeting." Harold Winters, our eldest board member and one of my father's original partners, cleared his throat. "The ownership documents. Oh, they're genuine. You've been the majority shareholder all along?" "Not just the majority shareholder, Harold," I corrected gently. "The sole owner of Reed Holdings, which in turn owns 78.6% of Reed International. The remaining shares are distributed among smaller investors, none of whom hold more than 3% individually." But Morgan Jonathan began. "Robert Morgan owns exactly 0 shares in Reed International," I cut in smoothly. "His compensation package included stock options, which he has leveraged extensively in his personal financial dealings. However, those options are contingent on his continued employment as CEO, a position that will be under review in today's meeting." The room erupted in overlapping questions, board members half rising from their seats. I remained calm, watching the realization spread across their faces. These men, and they were all men, despite my father's and my efforts to diversify the board over the years, were confronting a fundamental shift in the power structure they'd taken for granted. I raised a hand, and remarkably, silence fell. "Gentlemen, I understand this is unexpected, but I assure you, Reed International has always operated according to a clear chain of command. The only difference is that today, that chain is becoming visible." I opened my portfolio and distributed a single-page summary of Reed Holdings' global Assetza network, far larger than Reed International itself. What you've known as Reed International is, in fact, just one division of a much larger organization. Today's meeting will address not only the leadership of Reed International, but its integration into the broader vision of Reed Holdings. Harold Winters studied the document, his expression shifting from shock to something like admiration. "Thomas never fully retired, did he? This was his plan all along." "My father understood the business world wasn't ready for certain changes," I replied carefully. "He created a structure that would protect Reed International until the right moment arrived." "And that moment is now?" Jonathan asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. "Conveniently timed with your marital troubles?" I fixed him with a steady gaze, and he had the good sense to look uncomfortable. "No, Jonathan. That moment arrived 6 months ago when Robert began diverting company resources to fund his affair with Sophia Reed. The timing of their public announcement merely provided a suitable occasion for clarity." I closed my portfolio. "The shareholder meeting begins in 15 minutes. I suggest you use that time to review the documentation you've received and consider your positions carefully. Your responses today will determine your future with Reed Holdings." The implied threat wasn't subtle, nor was it meant to be. As I turned to leave, Harold Winters spoke again. "Catherine," he said, using my first name with the familiarity of someone who had bounced me on his knee as a child. "Thomas would be proud. He always said you'd know when the time was right." I allowed myself a small smile. "Thank you, Harold. I believe he would." The main boardroom of Reed International occupied the corner position of the executive floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan. It was designed to impress, to remind everyone, who entered of the power, concentrated in that room. Robert and Sophia were waiting inside, along with Robert's lawyer, nervous-looking man clutching a briefcase as if it contained his last hope of salvation, which, in a way, it did. Robert stood as I entered, his expression flickering between confusion, anger, and the beginning stages of fear. "Catherine, what is this? Security wouldn't let me access any systems. The board is acting strange, and now there are reporters downstairs saying that I'm Catherine Reed, owner of Reed International." I finished for him, setting my portfolio on the gleaming conference table. "They're correct." Sophia shifted in her seat, her triumphant expression from Friday night now replaced with uncertainty. She wore a carefully selected outfit crimson power suit, tasteful gold jewelry clearly chosen for what she'd expected to be her first appearance as Robert's official partner. "This is absurd," Robert scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've run Reed International for 15 years. The board appointed me CEO when Thomas Reed stepped down due to health concerns." "The board," I replied calmly, "approved your appointment as CEO on my recommendation, following my father's carefully structured plan. Your position has always been contingent on my approval, as stated quite clearly in your employment contract. Section 12, paragraph 4, I believe." Robert's lawyer frantically flipped through documents, his forehead beading with sweat. "This is a desperate attempt to leverage the company in our divorce," Robert declared, trying to regain control of the narrative. "It won't work, Catherine. I've built Reed International into what it is today. Everyone knows that." I smiled, not the practiced social smile I'd worn as his wife, but the genuine expression of someone appreciating irony. "What you've built, Robert, is an illusion. Every major decision you've made as CEO has been guided, shaped, or directly instructed by me." I moved to the head of the table, Robert's usual seat. "Those late-night strategy sessions where you'd bounce ideas off your supportive wife? Those casual questions I'd ask about upcoming deals? The helpful suggestions I'd offer when you were stuck? That was the actual CEO working through her public representative. 5 years earlier, Robert had been struggling with the expansion into Asian markets. His traditional approach wasn't yielding results, and the board was growing concerned. "I don't understand these people," he'd complained one night, pacing our living room. "We've offered excellent terms, better than our competitors. Why won't they sign?" I'd handed him a glass of scotch, settling beside him on the sofa. "Perhaps it's not about the terms," I'd suggested carefully. "In many Asian business cultures, relationships precede transactions. Have you spent time building connections with the decision makers?" He'd looked at me with that mixture of surprise and dismissal I'd grown accustomed to, acknowledging I occasionally had useful insights while simultaneously underestimating their source. "That's not how business works, Catherine. These are major corporations, not social clubs." I shrugged, letting it go. "Just a thought. By the way, didn't you mention Charles Winston's success in Singapore last year? How did he approach that market?" 2 days later, Robert had announced his brilliant new strategy to the board, focusing on relationship building before negotiation, exactly as I'd suggested, but presented as his own revelation after studying competitors' approaches. The Asian expansion had succeeded brilliantly, becoming one of the cornerstone achievements of his tenure as CEO. "You've never had an original strategic thought in your life, Robert," I said quietly. "You've been implementing my father's long-term vision, guided by my direction, while taking credit for the results." Sophia looked between us, the color draining from her face as she began to understand the implications. "The Milan acquisition," she said faintly. "The deal structure, the approach. That wasn't Robert's strategy, was it?" "No, Sophia, it wasn't," I confirmed. "Though I'm curious, When did you realize Robert wasn't the strategic genius he portrayed himself to be? Before or after you decided he was your ticket to the executive suite? Her eyes widened, and I knew I'd hit the mark. Sophia Reed had built her career by attaching herself to powerful men, using their influence to climb corporate ladders before discarding them for the next opportunity. Robert wasn't her first target, just the most ambitious. "This is slander," Robert's lawyer interjected, finally finding the relevant clause in the contract and looking increasingly distressed. "Miss Morgan cannot possibly—" "Miss Reed," I corrected. "Catherine Reed, sole inheritor of Thomas Reed's controlling interest in Reed Holdings and, by extension, Reed International. The documentation has been provided to your office this morning, along with the board and all relevant regulatory authorities." I turned back to Robert, whose face had taken on an ashen quality as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "The shareholder meeting begins in 5 minutes. You're welcome to attend, in fact. I insist upon it. After all, this restructuring announcement is one you've been planning for months." For a moment, the room fell completely silent. Through the windows, the morning sun illuminated Manhattan's skyline, the empire my father had built and entrusted to me. In the glass, I could see our reflections. Robert, slumped and diminished, Sophia, rigid with dawning horror, and myself, standing tall at the head of the table where I had always belonged. In that suspended moment, I felt not triumph, but a profound sense of rightness, of pieces falling into their proper places after years of careful arrangement. This wasn't about revenge for Robert's betrayal, though that had provided the perfect catalyst. This was about claiming my birthright, about honoring my father's legacy, about finally stepping into the light after 15 years in the shadows. I thought of my mother, Elizabeth Reed, who had taught me that true strength wasn't in dominating others, but in knowing your own worth. She had left when I was 18, unable to bear my father's constant focus on business above family. Her departure had broken something in him, had made him even more determined that I would be prepared to stand on my own. "Never depend on anyone else for your sense of value, Catherine," she'd told me the day she left. "Not your father, not any man, not any company. Know who you are and the rest will follow." I hadn't understood then. Standing here now, I finally did. The intercom chimed softly, breaking the silence. Diana's voice came through. "Miss Reed, the shareholders are connected, and the board members are taking their seats. We're ready to begin whenever you are." "Thank you, Diana," I replied. "We'll join them momentarily." I gathered my portfolio and moved toward the door, pausing beside Robert. "One last thing," I said quietly, for his ears alone. "Every strategy you've claimed as yours, every brilliant insight you've boasted about, every deal you've credited to your business acumen, it's all documented. My instructions, your implementation. Should you choose to contest what happens today, that documentation becomes public, your choice." His face contorted with anger, humiliation, and the first flickers of fear. "You planned this," he hissed. "All of it, even Sophia." I smiled. "Not all of it, Robert. Your choices were entirely your own. I simply created an environment where those choices would reveal exactly who you are." The main conference room fell silent as I entered, followed by Robert, Sophia, and the increasingly distraught lawyer. The board members were already seated, their expressions ranging from shock to calculation as they reassessed their positions in this new reality. On the wall of screens, shareholders from around the world watched intently, the biggest investors prominently displayed. Diana had arranged the seating perfectly. My chair at the head of the table, with Robert positioned not opposite me but to my right, symbolically demoted from equal to subordinate. Sophia had been placed near the far end, physically separated from Robert and the centers of power. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the room and to the virtual participants. For those who don't know me, I am Catherine Reed, founder Thomas Reed's daughter and the owner of Reed Holdings, which controls the majority interest in Reed International. I paused, allowing the gravity of the statement to settle. Today's meeting was originally scheduled to discuss a restructuring plan proposed by CEO Robert Morgan. We will indeed be discussing restructuring, though perhaps not in the manner some expected. The screens behind me filled with the Reed Holdings organizational chart, a complex network of companies, investments, and subsidiaries that dwarfed Reed International itself. Audible gasps came from several board members as they realized the true scope of the operation. For the past 15 years, I continued, Reed International has operated as the public-facing division of a much larger enterprise. While you've been focused on quarterly results and market position within your immediate competitors, Reed Holdings has been building a global network that extends far beyond traditional consulting services. I advanced to the next slide, showing financial projections that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. These are the actual numbers, gentlemen. Your investment has been performing significantly better than you realized, part of a carefully structured approach to maintaining privacy while building long-term value. Robert stared at the screen, the color draining from his face as he realized how small his supposed empire was in comparison to the true Reed Holdings. Everything he'd thought he'd built, every achievement he'd claimed, was being systematically revealed as part of a much larger design in which he'd been merely a temporary player. Now, I said, let's address the immediate concerns. First, the Milan acquisition will proceed, but under revised terms. I placed a hand on the back of Robert's chair, feeling him tense at the touch. Our legal team has prepared updated contracts that eliminate certain unnecessary expenses. Jonathan Pierce found his voice first. These projections, he said, studying the documents Lawrence had distributed, they're based on market trends that weren't public knowledge when his voice trailed off as understanding dawned. When Robert began planning his version, I finished for him. Correct. Reed Holdings has access to significantly more market data than Reed International. We've been using that information to guide company strategy for years, though, of course, we had to be subtle about it. I advanced to the next slide, revealing the true organizational structure of Reed Holdings' executive team positions that had operated in the shadows for years, quietly guiding Reed International's public-facing leadership. As you can see, the restructuring Mr. Morgan planned to announce today was, in fact, part of a larger reorganization already underway. However, his version included several elements that conflicted with Reed Holdings' long-term strategy. I clicked to a side-by-side comparison of Robert's planned changes versus the actual Reed Holdings plan. Specifically, Mr. Morgan proposed eliminating several key positions, primarily those held by employees loyal to the original Reed vision. These terminations will not be happening. Robert surged to his feet. This is outrageous. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Reed International. These decisions fall under my authority. Your authority, I replied calmly, has always been contingent on my approval, as clearly stated in your employment contract. Given recent developments, including your misappropriation of company resources for personal matters, that approval has been withdrawn. Lawrence stepped forward, distributing another set of documents. These are the findings of our internal audit regarding the Milan acquisition expenses. As you'll see, there are numerous instances where company funds were used for non-business purposes. Robert's lawyer frantically scanned the documents, his expression growing increasingly alarmed. These allegations are thoroughly documented. Lawrence finished for him. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, private jet usage, all company resources used to facilitate Mr. Morgan's personal relationship with Miss Reed. Sophia stiffened in her chair, her carefully cultivated professional image crumbling as the board members glanced between her and the expense reports. The elegant marketing director, who had built her reputation on strategic brilliance, was being revealed as something far more calculating. "The ethical implications are clear," I continued. "But perhaps more relevant to today's discussion are the fiduciary considerations. Mr. Morgan's decisions have consistently prioritized personal benefit over shareholder value, direct violation of his responsibilities as CEO. Which brings me to an important announcement," I said, nodding to Diana, who distributed a final set of documents. "Effective immediately, Robert Morgan's position as CEO of Reed International is terminated for cause. The board will establish an interim leadership team while we complete the integration of Reed International into Reed Holdings' global structure." The room erupted in overlapping voice board members, demanding clarification, shareholders on the screens calling for details, Robert shouting about contracts and legal action. Through it all, I remained calm, standing at the head of the table with the steady presence my father had taught me years ago. When the noise subsided, Harold Winters spoke. "The board will need to vote on this." Of course, I agreed, though I should clarify that with my controlling interest, the outcome is predetermined. This vote is a courtesy and opportunity for each of you to declare your position moving forward. The implication was clear. Those who opposed me would not be part of Reed Holdings' future. One by one, the board members registered their votes. Only Jonathan Pierce and 2 others sided with Roberta's futile gesture that would cost them dearly. As the results were tallied, Robert made one final attempt to regain control. "The shareholders won't stand for this," he declared, gesturing to the screens where investors watched the proceedings. "I've delivered consistent returns, expanded into new markets, doubled the stock price." "Mr. Morgan," came a voice from one of the screens, Helen Takamoto, one of our largest independent investors. "I've just reviewed the complete Reed Holdings portfolio. If these numbers are accurate, you haven't been delivering returns. You've been constraining them, Miss Reed. I fully support this transition and look forward to seeing Reed International's performance without artificial limitations." Other shareholders quickly echoed her sentiment, the tide turning decisively as they recognized where the true power and opportunity lay. Robert looked around wildly, watching as his carefully constructed world collapsed. "This isn't over," he said, his voice barely controlled. "You can't just erase 15 years of leadership. The clients, the partners, they're loyal to me." I smiled, almost pitying him in that moment. "Are they, Robert? Let's test that theory." I nodded to Diana, who pressed a button on her tablet. The central screen switched to a live feed from another conference room, where a familiar figure sat watching the proceedings. "Charles," I said warmly, "thank you for joining us." Charles Winston, CEO of Winston Global and Robert's most significant competitor, nodded in greeting. "Catherine, it's good to finally see you take your rightful place." Robert stared at the screen in disbelief. "Winston? What is this?" "This," I explained, "is the culmination of a partnership that began long before you became CEO. Winston Global and Reed Holdings have been planning a merger of our Asian operations for the past decade." "The Singapore deal," Robert whispered, realization dawning. "Last year's failed acquisition attempt." "Wasn't a failure at all," I confirmed. "It was a carefully orchestrated step in a much larger plan. While you were focusing on visible competition, the real work was happening behind the scenes." I turned to the board members. "The Winston Reed merger papers will be finalized this afternoon. Our combined entity will control approximately 43% of the global market in our sectora position that would have been impossible if Robert's limited vision had prevailed." Charles smiled from the screen. "I've always enjoyed competing with you, Robert. Though I should clarify I was never competing with you." Catherine and I have been aligned for years, positioning our companies for this moment. The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. Every victory he'd claimed, every competitor he'd believed, he'd outmaneuvered all of it, had been part of a larger strategy he'd never glimpsed. Sophia, who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, suddenly found her voice. "The quarterly review meetings," she said, looking at me with dawning comprehension. "The ones Robert usually sent me to handle." "You were actually reporting directly to my team," I confirmed, though you didn't realize it. Every presentation, every proposal was being evaluated at a much higher level. 6 months earlier, Sophia had proudly presented her analysis of the Asian market to what she believed was a routine quarterly review committee. She'd been spectacular, confident, insightful, commanding the room with a presence that had impressed everyone present. What she hadn't known was that the committee consisted primarily of Reed Holdings executives, not Reed International managers. They'd been evaluating not just her marketing strategy, but her as a potential threat. "She's ambitious," Margaret Winston had commented afterward when we discussed the meeting privately, "and calculating. Watch her carefully, Catherine. She reminds me of women I've seen before, the ones who climb by attaching themselves to powerful men." "I've been watching her for months," I'd replied. "She's been meeting Robert privately, outside of scheduled business functions. The pattern is clear." Margaret had nodded thoughtfully. "The question is, what will you do about it?" "Nothing," I'd said simply. "Sometimes the most effective strategy is to let your opponents believe they're winning." Robert's ego and Sophia's ambition will reveal exactly who they are if I simply create the right environment. "Every strategy you presented," I told Sophia, watching realization dawn on her face, "every market analysis you so confidently delivered was based on incomplete data. The trends you identified represent barely 30% of our actual global operations." Her carefully constructed professional reputation, the strategic insight she'd leveraged to advance her career, was being revealed as fundamentally flawed. Not because she lacked talent, but because she'd been permitted to see only what served my purposes. "Security will escort you both from the building," I said, nodding to the guards who had quietly entered the room. "Your personal belongings will be packed and delivered after a thorough review for company property." Robert's lawyer made one last desperate attempt. "Miss Reed, my client is prepared to negotiate a reasonable separation agreement that acknowledges his contributions while—" "Your client," I interrupted, "signed an employment contract with very specific terms regarding termination for cause. Those terms will be enforced to the letter. As for his contributions, those have been thoroughly documented and will be appropriately recognized. Nothing more, nothing less." As security approached, Robert made a final appeal not to the board or shareholders, but directly to me. 15 years, Catherine," he said, his voice low and urgent. 15 years of marriage. That has to count for something." I met his gaze steadily, allowing myself to feel, just for a moment, the full weight of his betrayal, not just the affair with Sophia, but the years of taking credit for my work, of dismissing my insights, of treating me as an accessory to his success rather than its architect. "It counted for everything, Robert," I replied quietly. "It gave me 15 years to observe how you operate, to document your methods, to understand exactly who you are when you think no one is watching. I couldn't have designed a more thorough evaluation process if I'd tried." As Robert and Sophia were escorted from the room, a palpable shift occurred among the remaining board members and shareholders. The initial shock was giving way to calculation to a reassessment of alliances and opportunities in this new reality. "Now," I said, returning to the presentation, "let's discuss the actual restructuring plan for Reed International's integration into Reed Holdings' global strategy." For the next hour, I outlined the vision my father and I had developed over a decade a comprehensive approach to expanding Reed's influence across markets and sectors. The board members who had opposed me remained silent, their futures with the company clearly limited. Those who had recognized which way the wind was blowing participated enthusiastically, eager to secure their positions in the new order. When the formal meeting concluded, I asked the board members to remain while the shareholder feed was disconnected. Once we were alone, I addressed them directly. Gentlemen, today marks a significant transition for Reed International. Some of you knew my father well and understood his vision. Others came later, knowing only the company as it appeared under Robert's leadership. I moved around the table slowly, making eye contact with each member. Each of you now faces a choice. Those who wish to be part of Reed Holdings' future will have the opportunity to demonstrate your value. Those who prefer to align with the past are welcome to follow Robert Morgan out the door with appropriate separation packages, of course. Jonathan Pierce, his earlier confidence now thoroughly deflated, cleared his throat. Catherine Ems. Reed, you can't possibly intend to reconstruct the entire board. Can't I? I replied mildly. The bylaws give the majority shareholder that authority. However, I prefer to think of this as an opportunity for clarity. Reed Holdings values loyalty, discretion, and a focus on long-term strategy over short-term gains. Board members who share those values will find their positions secure and potentially enhanced. I paused, letting that sink in. Those with other priorities may wish to consider their options. As the board members filed out, Harold Winters remained behind. He'd known me since childhood, had been one of my father's closest confidants, and had recognized me immediately as Thomas Reed's daughter despite 15 years as Catherine Morgan. Your father would be proud, he said simply. Though I think he might have been surprised by your patience. 15 years is a long time to wait. It wasn't just waiting, Harold, I replied. It was learning, observing, building networks and alliances that will serve Reed Holdings for decades to come. He nodded thoughtfully. And Robert? What happens to him now? That depends on him, I said. The evidence of financial misconduct is clear, but I'm not interested in public humiliation or criminal charges unless he forces that path. A quiet exit with appropriate non-disclosure agreements would be preferable for everyone. Harold studied me for a long moment. You're more merciful than Thomas would have been. Perhaps, I acknowledged. Or perhaps just more practical. Destroying Robert publicly might be satisfying, but it would distract from our actual goals. Reed Holdings doesn't need that kind of attention. As Harold left, Diana entered with fresh reports and a knowing smile. The press is in a frenzy, she reported. The revelation of Reed Holdings' existence and your position as owner has triggered a complete reassessment of the entire sector. Financial analysts are scrambling to update their models. And Robert? I asked. Security confirms he's left the building. He attempted to access his office on the way out, but was denied. His personal assistant has already submitted her resignation. Apparently, she's not interested in being associated with his downfall. I nodded, unsurprised. Robert had inspired ambition in his subordinates, but never loyalty. Those who had served him had done so for what he could offer, not out of any personal connection. Now that his power was gone, they would scatter quickly. The Winston merger documents are ready for your review, Diana continued. Charles is quite eager to finalize the deal this afternoon, and Margaret called the wives are still expecting you for lunch at the Century Club. For a moment, I sat alone in the boardroom, allowing myself to feel the full impact of the morning's events. This wasn't just a corporate takeover or the resolution of a personal betrayal. It was the fulfillment of my father's vision and the beginning of my own. I thought of the young woman I had been 15 years ago, brilliant but untested, determined to prove herself in a world that would judge her by her gender and her age, before considering her abilities. My father had seen what would happen if I tried to take control openly then. He'd known I needed time to build my own network, to understand the subtle currents of power that flowed beneath the visible structures of business. The patience he had taught me, the ability to wait for exactly the right moment that seemed frustrating then. Now I recognized it as perhaps the most valuable lesson he'd imparted. In business, as in chess, timing was everything. The player who moved too soon revealed their strategy and limited their options. The player who waited for the perfect moment could change the entire game with a single move. Robert's betrayal with Sophia had provided that perfect momenta catalyst that allowed me to reveal myself not as a wronged wife seeking revenge, but as a strategic leader reclaiming control of her company from an unethical CEO. The narrative was crucial, and timing had made it possible. My phone chimed with a messaging from any of the board members or executives scrambling to understand the new power structure, but from a number I hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. "Catherine, it's your mother. I've been following the news. It's time we talked. Call me when you're ready." Elizabeth Rydme, mother who had left when I was 18, unable to bear my father's relentless focus on business above family. She had tried to take me with her, to save me, as she'd put it, from becoming like him. I had chosen to stay, unable to abandon my father or the legacy he was building. For years, I'd believed she had simply disappeared, starting a new life somewhere far from the Reed name and fortune. Only after my father's death had I discovered the truth that he had maintained contact with her, had even provided financial support despite her protests. Their relationship had been complex until the end, marked by both love and fundamental incompatibility. And now, on this day of all days, she had reached out. I set the phone down without responding. That was a complication for another time. Today was about completing what my father and I had started, revealing Reed Holdings to the world and establishing my position as its rightful leader. Diana reappeared at the door. "Miss Reed?" "The executive team is assembled in the strategy room. They're eager to meet you officially, that is." I smiled, rising from my chair. The executive team she referred to was my team, the Shadow Leadership, that had operated behind the scenes for 15 years, guiding Reed International while remaining invisible to all but a select few. "Thank you, Diana. Let's not keep them waiting any longer." The strategy room occupied the northeast corner of the executive floor, space Robert had always believed was used primarily for document storage and occasional overflow meetings. In reality, it had been the true command center of Reed Holdings since my father's death, equipped with secure communication systems and data analysis capabilities far beyond anything in the official executive offices. As I entered, a dozen people rose from their seats, men and women who had worked in the shadows for years, their positions known only to a trusted few. These were the actual department heads, the strategists and analysts who had shaped Reed's global operations, while their public-facing counterparts took credit for their work. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, feeling a surge of pride at finally addressing them openly. "Thank you for your patience, your discretion, and your unwavering commitment to Reed Holdings. Today marks the end of our shadow operation and the beginning of a new era." Michael Chin, our actual chief financial officer and Lawrence's younger brother, stepped forward with a tablet. "The markets are responding exactly as predicted, Miss Reed." Reed International stock initially dropped 12% on news of Robert's departure, but has since rebounded 27% as information about Reed Holdings becomes public. Overall, market capitalization has increased by approximately 43% since this morning. "And the Winston merger announcement?" I asked. "Scheduled for 3 p.m., replied Ananya Sharma, our Global Strategy Director. "The Asian markets will be open by then. We're projecting a significant realignment across the sector once the full scope of the merger becomes clear." I nodded, taking in the Rumi team, my father's legacy, and now my public responsibility. For 15 years, these people had operated in the background, their brilliance hidden behind Robert's mediocre leadership. Now they would finally receive the recognition they deserved. Before we proceed with today's agenda, I said, there's one matter I'd like to address. I turned to Sarah Lynn, who had served as my eyes and ears in the marketing department for the past year. Sarah, I understand you've been offered the position of marketing director following Sophia's departure. She nodded, clearly surprised that I was aware of this. Yes, Miss Reed. The offer came through HR just after the board meeting. I'd like you to decline, I said, causing a ripple of surprise through the room. Not because you aren't qualified, you absolutely are, but because I have a different role in mind for you. I gestured to Diana, who handed me a folder. As of today, Reed Holdings is establishing a new division focused on identifying and supporting women in business who have been held back by systemic barriers. I'd like you to lead it. Sarah's eyes widened. Miss Reed, the second, don't know what to say. Say yes, I replied with a smile. Your experience with Sophia gave you a front-row seat to how ambitious women are often forced to align themselves with powerful men to advance. I'd like you to help create pathways that don't require such compromises. As Sarah accepted the folder with hands that trembled slightly, the door opened again. Diana entered, followed by an elegant older woman whose presence immediately commanded attention. Margaret Winston swept into the room with the confident grace of someone accustomed to power, her silver hair perfectly styled, her Chanel suit impeccable. Behind her came 4 other women of similar age and bearing the wives of CEOs and board members who had formed their own shadow network years ago. Catherine, Margaret said warmly, embracing me. Charles told me it went perfectly. The board never knew what hit them. I returned her embrace, aware of the surprised looks from my team. Few of them knew about the alliance I had cultivated with the wiveswomen who had been systematically underestimated by their husbands and the business world at large. Everyone, I said, turning to the room, I'd like you to meet my other executive team. For years, while Reed Holdings operated in the shadows, these women have been our eyes and ears in places even our best operatives couldn't access: the private clubs, charity galas, and social functions, where the real deals often take shape. Margaret smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye that belied her elegant appearance. The advantage of being dismissed as merely decorative, she said, is that people speak freely in front of you. They never consider that the CEO's wife might understand exactly what they're discussing, or that she might be reporting back to someone like Catherine. The revelation sent another ripple of surprise through the room. My team was beginning to understand the full scope of the network I had built, not just the shadow executives within Reed Holdings, but an external intelligence apparatus comprised of women who had been systematically excluded from formal power structures. For 15 years, I continued, Margaret and her network have provided crucial intelligence on competitors, market trends, and potential threats. Their contributions have been instrumental to Reed Holdings' success, though, until today, that fact has remained one of our most closely guarded secrets. I moved to the head of the conference table, taking my rightful place. Now shall we discuss the future of Reed Holdings? We have a merger to finalize, a company to restructure, and a new public identity to establish. As the meeting proceeded, I watched my 2 teams begin to integrate the shadow executives who had operated Reed Holdings from behind the scenes and the network of women who had gathered intelligence from the social periphery. Together, they represented a new kind of power structure, one that recognized talent and contribution regardless of traditional pathways or expectations. When the strategy session concluded 2 hours later, Margaret lingered behind. You've waited a long time for this day, she said, studying me with the shrewd assessment that had made her such a valuable ally. Was it worth it? I considered the question, thinking of the years spent playing a role, of watching Robert take credit for my work, of carefully building the networks and systems that would eventually allow me to emerge from the shadows. Yes, I said finally, though not for the reasons I expected when my father first proposed this path. I thought this was about proving myself in a world that wouldn't accept a young woman as CEO. Now I understand it was about building something entirely new, something neither my father nor Robert could have envisioned. Margaret nodded, satisfied with my answer. The Century Club is waiting. The wives are eager to celebrate with you, and to discuss how this new arrangement might benefit all of us. As we prepared to leave, Diana appeared at the door once more, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Miss Reed, there's a visitor in reception," she says. Diana paused, clearly uncomfortable. "She says she's your mother." "Margaret Winston never ceases to amaze me," my mother said softly, studying the business card. "She always knows exactly when to reveal what she's been holding in reserve." "You knew about Elizabeth Morgan?" I asked, surprised by my mother's lack of shock. "I suspected," she admitted. "There were inconsistencies in Thomas's history before we met. Periods of time he wouldn't discuss, financial commitments he never explained fully." She touched the card gently. "When I left, I chose not to pursue those suspicions. It seemed unnecessary at that point." I slipped the card back into the envelope, my mind racing with implications. A half-sister I had never met, living her own life far from the Reed Empire, perhaps unaware of her connection to our family namer, perhaps carrying her own version of our complicated legacy. "Will you contact her?" my mother asked as we moved toward the exit. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "Perhaps, but not immediately. Some revelations require careful timing. If 15 years in the shadows had taught me anything, it was the power of patience, of waiting for precisely the right moment to reveal what had long been hidden." My half-sister's existence represented yet another piece of the Reed family puzzle, another potential bridge between worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. Outside the Pierre, the night air was crisp with early autumn, the lights of Fifth Avenue creating a glittering pathway into the heart of Manhattan. My car waited at the curb, James standing at attention beside the open door. "May I drive you home, Miss Reed?" he asked my mother. The courtesy extended naturally after months of her gradual reintegration into my life. "Thank you, James, but I'll take a separate car," she replied. "Catherine and I have both had quite enough revelations for one evening. A little space to process seems wise." Her insight recognizing when connection was appropriate and when distance was necessary was something I had come to value deeply during our cautious reconciliation. We were learning to navigate our relationship as adults, respecting each other's boundaries while building new understanding. "I'll call you tomorrow," I promised, as we embraced briefly. "Perhaps lunch before your flight back to Paris?" "I'd like that," she agreed. "And Catherine." She paused, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Whatever you decide about Elizabeth Morgan, remember that family is what we make of it, not just what we inherit. The Reed legacy is yours to define now." As her car pulled away, I settled into the back seat of my own vehicle, the envelope containing Margaret Winston's note and Elizabeth Morgan's business card resting in my lap. James caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "To the penthouse, Miss Reed?" "Yes, James," I replied. "It's been quite an evening." As we moved through the nighttime streets of Manhattan, I found myself reflecting on the nature of power and how my understanding of it had evolved. For my father, power had been primarily about control of markets, of competitors, of his own carefully constructed narrative. For 15 years, I had operated within that framework, patiently accumulating influence while remaining in the shadows. But these past 6 months had revealed different dimensions of power, the strength and vulnerability, the influence that comes through connection rather than control, The authority that emerges from integration rather than domination, not replacing my father's legacy but expanding it, enriching it with perspectives he had never fully valued. The penthouse was quiet when I arrived. The lights of the city spread out below like a reflection of the stars above. I moved through the rooms that had been my father's, now mine, feeling his presence in the carefully selected artwork, the leather-bound books, the chess set perpetually mid-game. In his study my study, now I opened the hidden safe behind the bookshelf where I kept the most important documents of the Reed legacy. The original founding papers of Reed International, my father's final letter to me, the silver locket that connected my mother's past to my present. Now, I added Margaret Winston's note and Elizabeth Morgan's business card, another piece of the evolving puzzle that was the Reed family history. Not a secret to be buried or denied, but a potential connection to be explored when the time was right. As I closed the safe, my phone chimed with a message from Charles Winston. Asian markets responding exceptionally well to the initiative announcement. Looks like social impact and business success can coexist after all. Breakfast tomorrow to discuss next phase. I smiled, recognizing Charles's characteristic blend of strategic thinking and personal support. Like Margaret, he had become both business ally and mentor during these months of transition, helping me navigate the public role I had assumed after 15 years in the shadows. Another message followed, this one from Sarah Lynn. The first Reed Fellows cohort is officially launched. Initial media coverage extremely positive. Video of your speech already at 500K views and climbing. Number The Silent Power, trending on social media. The hashtag made me laugh, a reference to the nickname financial journalists had given me in the days following the Reed revelation. The Silent Power, the woman who had operated invisibly for 15 years, shaping a global business empire while being dismissed as merely the CEO's supportive wife. I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city that had been the center of my family's orbit for generations. So much had changed in the past 6 months, yet the fundamental truth remained. I was Catherine Reed, heir to my father's business acumen and strategic vision, inheritor of my mother's insistence on maintaining identity beyond corporate achievement. But I was also becoming something entirely new, a leader who integrated shadows and light, who understood power as connection rather than just control, who recognized that true legacy was measured in lives impacted rather than just markets dominated. My phone chimed once more, an email notification from Diana with the subject line, Reed Winston Alliance Q3 results. Business continued. The markets moved on. The strategic chess game my father had taught me remained in play, but it was no longer the only game, no longer the sole measure of success or fulfillment. I thought of Elizabeth Morgantha, half-sister I had never met, living her life in Denver, far from the Reed corporate empire. What perspective might she offer on our shared legacy? What wisdom might she have gained from her separate journey? What bridges might we build between our different experiences of being Thomas Reed's daughters? These questions would wait for another day. For now, I had a successful initiative launch to celebrate, an evolving relationship with my mother to nurture, a global business alliance to guide, and a personal integration to continue developing, balancing power with purpose, ambition with connection, strategic thinking with emotional intelligence. The quiet wife had stepped into the light, revealing herself as the silent power behind Reed International. But the revelation wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one I was writing on my own terms, in my own time, with wisdom hard-won through patience, observation, and the courage to finally claim my full inheritance. Not just Reed International or even Reed Holdings, but the complete legacy of both my parents, the strategic brilliance of Thomas Reed, and the authentic independence of Elizabeth Reed, integrated and transformed into something entirely my own. Standing at the window of the penthouse that had once been my father's sanctuary, I felt a profound sense of coming full circle. The young woman who had chosen to stay with her father rather than follow her mother, who had agreed to operate from the shadows while a public-facing CEO took the spotlight, who had patiently accumulated influence while appearing to have none. That woman had fulfilled her mission perfectly. But in doing so, she had discovered truths her father never fully grasped and wisdom her mother had sought by leaving. The integration of those seemingly opposing perspectives had created something new: a leader who understood both visible and invisible forms of power, who recognized the value of patience alongside ambition, who saw connection as essential rather than peripheral to achievement. I touched the silver locket at my throat, the tangible symbol of what had been broken and what might yet be healed. Not a return to what once was, but the creation of something new from the fragments of the past. The Reed legacy continuing, but transformed, expanded beyond market dominance to include social impact, beyond corporate hierarchy to embrace diverse forms of leadership, beyond financial metrics to value human connection. In the reflection of the window glass, I saw not just myself, but echoes of both my parents, my father's determined focus, my mother's quiet strength, not forced to choose between their divergent paths as I once had been, but finding a way to honor the wisdom of both while charting my own course forward. The quiet wife was gone. In her place stood the leader I had always been destined to become on my own terms, in my own time, with a vision that extended far beyond what either of my parents could have imagined. 3 months later, I stood on the observation deck of a small office building in downtown Denver, looking out at the Rocky Mountains rising in the distance. The winter air was crisp and clear, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city below. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice beside me. "Different from the Manhattan skyline, but it has its own kind of power." Elizabeth Morgan stood at the railing, her gaze focused on the distant mountains. At 52, she was 7 years my senior, though we shared an unmistakable resemblance. The same dark eyes, the same determined set to our jaws, the same thoughtful intensity that had been our father's hallmark. Our first meeting, arranged through careful intermediaries after months of consideration, had been cautious but not uncomfortable. Like two chess players evaluating each other across a board, we had exchanged pleasantries, shared carefully selected details about our lives, and gradually begun the process of discovering what it meant to be Thomas Reed's daughter-son, acknowledged and groomed for leadership, one kept separate from the family legacy. "I never wanted any part of it, you know," Elizabeth said, continuing our earlier conversation. The Reed name, the corporate empire, the expectations. When I learned who my father was really learned, beyond my mother's vague explanations, I made a deliberate choice to build something entirely different. Her investment firm specialized in supporting women-owned businesses in the Rocky Mountain region's mall to medium enterprises focused on sustainability and community impact. Successful but purposely limited in scale, profitable but never at the expense of its core values. "Was that a rejection of his legacy?" I asked, "or your own interpretation of it?" She smiled, the expression so like our father's that it created an echo across decades. "Both, I suppose. I rejected the parts that felt limiting: the obsession with market dominance, the hierarchical structure, the narrow definition of success. But I embraced the strategic thinking, the long-term perspective, the commitment to building something meaningful. It was a pattern I recognized, the same integration I had been working toward, balancing the lessons of our father's ambition with a broader understanding of purpose and connection. Elizabeth had found her version of that balance decades before I had begun to seek my own. "He knew about you," I said, offering this truth as a gesture of trust. "All those years, he kept track of your progress, your accomplishments. There were reports in his private files, your college graduation, your first business venture, the founding of Morgan Investments." She nodded, unsurprised. "I know. His lawyer contacted me after his death, delivered a letter and a substantial inheritance I never expected nor particularly wanted." Classic. Thomas Reed. Maintaining control even from beyond the grave. The hint of bitterness in her tone was tempered with something like rueful acceptance, the perspective of someone who had long ago made peace with complicated truths. "What did the letter say?" I asked, curious about this final communication from our father to the daughter he had never publicly acknowledged. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, considering whether to share this private message, that he respected the path I had chosen, that he recognized it as a different but equally valid expression of the Reed legacy, that he was proud of what I had built, even if he didn't understand all my choices. She turned to face me directly, and that someday, if circumstances aligned properly, he hoped his daughters might find value in knowing each other. The revelation didn't surprise me as much as it might have months earlier. Since reading my father's final letter, I had come to recognize the reflective wisdom he had developed in his later years, the understanding that had come too late to repair his marriage, but perhaps not too late to influence the future of his family legacy. "And do you?" I asked, meeting her gaze directly. "Find value in knowing me?" Her smile warmed, becoming more genuine. "I'm still deciding, but I'm intrigued by what you're building with the Reed Women's Leadership Initiative. It seems you've found your own way of reinterpreting the Reed legacy, neither rejecting it entirely as I did, nor accepting it uncritically as he might have expected. Integration rather than opposition," I said, echoing Charles Winston's observation from months earlier, honoring the past while transforming it into something new. We returned inside to her office, where photographs of her family lined the bookshelf vase, a husband of 30 years. 2 grown children pursuing their own paths far from the financial world, a life built on connection and purpose rather than corporate achievement alone. "I've been following the Reed-Winston Alliance developments," Elizabeth said as we settled into comfortable chairs by the window. "Impressive market performance, especially given the economic headwinds this quarter." I nodded, acknowledging the business success, while recognizing it was only part of the story I wanted to share. The initiative is expanding faster than we projected. We've launched programs in Chicago and Atlanta, with San Francisco and Boston coming next quarter. The demand has been remarkable. "Women recognizing other forms of power beyond traditional corporate hierarchies," Elizabeth observed. "Something our father never fully understood, despite his strategic brilliance. Or perhaps began to understand too late," I suggested, thinking of his final letter. His last advice to me was about balance, about succeeding where he had failed in integrating power with purpose, ambition with connection. Elizabeth studied me thoughtfully. "And how are you doing with that integration? Finding your own balance?" It was the same question my mother had asked months earlier at the P&O about success, but about fulfillment. Not about achievement, but about wholeness. Coming from Elizabeth, it carried a different weight, the perspective of someone who had chosen a fundamentally different approach to the Reed legacy, yet still carried the imprint of our shared inheritance. "I'm continuing to become," I answered honestly. "Leading Reed Holdings and the Alliance provides challenges and opportunities I value deeply, but the initiative has opened dimensions. I never anticipated connections and impacts that can't be measured in market share or profit margins." I paused, considering how to articulate the evolution that had occurred since stepping out of the shadows. I operated invisibly for 15 years, patiently accumulating influence while appearing to have none. That experience taught me to value different forms of power, to recognize strength in unexpected places. "The silent power," Elizabeth said with a slight smile. "I saw the hashtag trending after your initiative launch. Quite the persona you've developed." "Not a persona," I corrected gently. "Just a different understanding of power than our father initially taught me. One that includes patience alongside ambition, connection alongside achievement, purpose alongside profit." Outside her office window, the winter sun was beginning to set, casting the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Two of Thomas Reed's daughter-son who had rejected his legacy and built something entirely different. One who had embraced his legacy and transformed it from within, watching the same sunset from perspectives shaped by our individual journeys. "Would you be interested in bringing the initiative to Denver?" Elizabeth asked suddenly. "Not as a Reed Holdings venture, but as a collaboration between Morgan Investments and the Reed Women's Leadership Initiative. A bridge between our different interpretations of the family legacy." The offer surprised Minot, just the practical suggestion, but the symbolic significance behind it. After decades of maintaining her distance from anything associated with the Reed name, Elizabeth was proposing a connection, a collaboration, a shared project that would acknowledge our relationship while respecting our distinct paths. "I'd like that," I replied, recognizing the importance of this moment, another bridge being built, another fragment of the past being integrated into a new understanding of the future. Though we'd need to discuss structure, resources, expectations. Elizabeth laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Still, Thomas Reed's daughter, I see strategic even in moments of connection." Her tone held no criticism, only recognition of our shared inheritance. "Yes, we'll work out the details. But the intention matters, tooth willingness to explore what we might build together, honoring both our differences and our common ground." As we continued our discussion, developing the outline of what would eventually become the Rocky Mountain Women's Leadership Collaborative, I found myself reflecting on the strange symmetry of our situations. Elizabeth had rejected the Reed corporate legacy to build something aligned with her own values, while I had operated within that legacy, gradually transforming it from the inside out. Different paths, different choices, yet both ultimately creating something that reflected our individual interpretations of power, purpose, and connection. Perhaps that was the true Reed legacy, not Reed International or Reed Holdings or even the Women's Leadership Initiative, but the capacity to envision and build, to transform challenges into opportunities, to create structures that reflected our deepest values. Not limited to corporate achievement, though that remained a valid expression, but extending to whatever forms of impact we chose to pursue. My father had recognized this broader understanding too late to fully implement it himself, but not too late to plant the seeds in both his daughter seeds that had grown in different soil but shared common DNA, producing distinct but related harvests. The following week, I stood at the podium in Reed International's main conference room, addressing the quarterly leadership meeting of the Reed-Winston Alliance. The room was filled with executives from both organizations, now fully integrated into a unified strategic approach that maintained the distinct strengths of each company, while creating something greater than either could have achieved independently. 6 months into our merger, I began. The financial results speak for themselves. I gestured to the screens behind me, where performance metrics demonstrated the Alliance's dominant market position and exceptional growth trajectory. By traditional measures, we have exceeded even our most ambitious projections. Charles Winston, seated in the front row, nodded in satisfaction. The merger he and my father had envisioned decades earlier had proven even more successful than anticipated, reshaping the competitive landscape of our industry and establishing a new standard for strategic partnerships. But today, I continued, I want to discuss measures beyond market share and profit margins impacts that won't appear on our quarterly reports, but will ultimately determine the true success of the Reed-Winston Alliance. I advanced to the next slide, showing the expanding network of the Women's Leadership Initiative operating in 6 cities with plans for international expansion. Alongside, it appeared a new logo, the Rocky Mountain Women's Leadership Collaborative, a joint venture between Morgan Investments and the Reed Initiative. Leadership takes many forms, I explained, some visible in traditional hierarchies, others operating through networks of influence and connection. True power emerges not just from position, but from purpose, from aligning achievement with meaning, strategic thinking with emotional intelligence, corporate success with human impact. As I outlined our vision for integrating these dimensions throughout the Alliance's operations, I was aware of the shift occurring in the room. Executives who had been trained in traditional business metrics beginning to recognize broader possibilities, leaders who had operated within conventional hierarchies considering different forms of influence and impact. Not replacing financial performance, but expanding it. Not rejecting corporate achievement, but enriching it with additional dimensions of value and purpose. The Reed-Winston Alliance becoming not just a dominant market force, but a laboratory for new forms of leadership, influence, and impact. After the presentation, as executives dispersed to breakout sessions focused on implementing these expanded metrics, Charles approached the podium. "Remarkable vision, Catherine," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Thomas laid the foundation, but you're building something he could never have fully imagined." "Integration rather than opposition," I replied, acknowledging his earlier insight. "Honoring the past while transforming it into something new." He nodded, understanding the significance of this evolution. "And Elizabeth Morgan? How does she fit into this expanding vision?" "As a partner," I said simply. "Different path, different choices, but ultimately a shared commitment to redefining power and purpose. Another perspective on the Reed legacy, valuable precisely because it developed independently." "Your father would be proud," Charles observed, though perhaps also somewhat perplexed. "This goes well beyond his original vision for Reed International." "Yes," I agreed. "And that's exactly as it should be. Legacies aren't meant to be preserved unchanged. They're meant to be built upon, expanded, transformed by each generation's unique perspective and purpose." That evening, I hosted a small dinner at the penthouse me mother, visiting from Paris. Elizabeth Morgan, in town for Alliance meetings. Margaret Winston, whose network of wives had evolved into a formal advisory council for the initiative, and Sarah Lynn, whose leadership of the initiative had exceeded all expectations. Women connected to the Reed legacy in different ways, each bringing her unique perspective to the table, not just literally for dinner, but figuratively in the evolving understanding of what that legacy might become. "To connections," my mother proposed as we raised our glasses in toast, "those broken and mended, those hidden and revealed, those yet to be discovered." "To legacy," Elizabeth added, "not just what we inherit, but what we choose to build." "To power," Margaret continued with her characteristic directness. "In all its forms, visible and invisible, acknowledged and unacknowledged." "To women's leadership," Sarah concluded. "Past, present, and future." I looked around the table at these remarkable women me mother who had walked away from wealth and position to preserve her authentic self, my half-sister who had rejected our father's corporate legacy to build something aligned with her own values, Margaret, who had created a shadow network of influence while being dismissed as merely decorative, and Sarah, representing a new generation of leaders, benefiting from paths these women had helped create. To integration, I offered, completing the toast of shadow and light, of achievement and connection, of past wisdom and future possibility. As conversation flowed around the table, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 15 years in the shadows, patiently accumulating influence while appearing to have none. The revelation of my true position, stepping into the light as head of Reed Holdings. The expansion of that role beyond corporate leadership to include social impact, beyond financial metrics to embrace human connection. Not rejecting my father's legacy but transforming it, not dismissing my mother's wisdom but integrating it, not simply claiming power but redefining it. The quiet wife was gone. In her place stood the leader I had always been destined to become on my own terms, in my own time, with a vision that extended far beyond what either of my parents could have imagined. The silent power, now fully revealed. Not just as head of a global business empire, but as a woman who understood that true strength emerged from integration rather than division, from connection rather than control, from purpose aligned with achievement rather than achievement alone. Later that night, after my guests had departed, I stood at the penthouse windows looking out at the Manhattan skyline, the physical manifestation of ambition and achievement that had been the center of the Reed family orbit for generations. I touched the silver locket at my throat, the tangible connection between my mother's past and my present. In my pocket rested my father's watch, the timepiece that had marked his most significant business milestones and now accompanied mine. Not forced to choose between their divergent paths, as I once had been, but finding a way to honor the wisdom of both while charting my own course forward. Not limited by their definitions of success or fulfillment, but expanding those definitions to create something neither could have fully envisioned. The Reed legacy continuing, but transformed a silent power now speaking clearly, a hidden influence now visible in the light, a patient strategy now fully revealed. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a conclusion, but an evolution. Not a single destination, but an ongoing journey of becoming. Catherine Reed, stepping fully into her power, not just the power of position or achievement, but the deeper power that emerges when we integrate all dimensions of ourselves, when we align purpose with ambition, when we connect personal fulfillment with public impact. The quiet wife had found her voice. The silent power had revealed her strength. And the story was just beginning.